Distinguished guests, and by that I include members of our alumni and our staff, ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure for me to welcome each and every one of you here to the University of New South Wales, to this, the first of the BrainFood talks for 2011. In welcoming you, I acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose traditional land we are gathered, and I also acknowledge their elders, past and present, who are the custodians of this land. Ever since I became Chancellor of this terrific university, I've always felt that getting people together, experts of great knowledge, to debate things and bringing people from all walks of life to listen to them is exactly what a university should do. And that's why whenever I can, I like to be at them. Today we have an excellent example of just that, because tonight we're very pleased to be here to basically talk about an issue of our time. They gave me in my notes various questions to ask in respect of what we're going to talk about, and having spoken to a couple of the speakers, I've decided they've got all the answers, so I'll wait for you to answer the questions or ask the questions later. But tonight, we're very pleased to welcome our well-known and I might say greatly respected Scientia Professor Gordon Parker AO to facilitate a discussion on navigating the maze, understanding mood disorders in adolescents and young people. Gordon is probably known to most of you. He is the Executive Director of the Black Dog Institute in Sydney. He's had a number of responsibilities for the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists and has been an active teacher, researcher and practitioner. There was a whole page and a half given to me about Gordon, but I'd like to just say from the heart that he's one of our great professors. He's a joy to work with, and I might say if everybody had the energy he had, I'm positive not only this university but Australia would be a much better place. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may, I will call upon Gordon, and he'll be joined by Matthew Johnson, Professor Ian Hickie AM, who we welcome sincerely to this university. He's an alumnus, by the way, and Lucinda Napper as well. So I now call upon Gordon to introduce the topic and our speakers.
My sincere thanks, Chancellor Gonski, David, for those very generous words, and for not mentioning that I've been at the university for more than a third of a century. I'm an adolescent at heart. So also could I thank the organisers for the invitation and thank all of you for attending. It speaks again to the tremendous destigmatisation of mood disorders in this country when we see so many people turning up on a topic of this importance. I'd like to make a few introductory comments. Then we're going to have Matthew Johnson give a presentation, and I'll explain that. Then I'll invite the other two speakers to join me. I will give them some probe questions to open the topic up and to pick up on what I think may be some key components. And then I'd hope we'd have plenty of time for questions and answers. To set the backdrop, mood disorders affect everybody. You either have a mood disorder, or you have a relative with a mood disorder, or you have a friend with a mood disorder, or you have a work colleague with a mood disorder. Unfortunately, despite the sophistication of medicine these days, in my view, mood disorders tend to be homogenised. So we hear terms like major depression. We hear the concept of depression as an it, and people ascribing differing causes. When my personal view is that there are quite differing expressions of mood disorders, bipolar and unipolar and so on and so forth. And that is a major problem in and of itself. So when Kerry Ayres, who's in the audience, and I wrote this book a couple of years ago about navigating teenage depression, we provided a vignette of a 18-year-old girl who had developed depression. And we tried to create the analogy of an elephant being observed by the wise men. So she had a backdrop of her mother having a severe biological mood disorder and being hospitalised, and she'd become the parentified child. She also was bullied at school because people judged her as overweight. She was sitting for Year 12 exams, and she'd had a friend commit suicide. She also saw herself as bad, lazy, and stupid, and she was depressed. What I'd like to suggest to you that in most areas of Western psychiatry, that vignette would be interpreted in multiple differing ways. If with that story she went to see a doctor, the doctor would probably say, well, look, this sounds like a biological depression because mother's had a depression, so I'll put her on antidepressants. If she'd gone to a school counsellor, probably would be said this was a reactive depression because she's being bullied and she's sitting for Year 12 exams, and we'll give her counselling. And if she'd gone to a psychologist, the psychologist would possibly have said, well, she's got a faulty attributional system. She sees herself as lazy and stupid, so we'll give her cognitive behaviour therapy. The point I want to make is that, unfortunately, people bring their own perspectives to depression and ascribe differing causes and differing treatments. And the degree to which medicine and psychiatry differs, I think, is principally in this area that we frequently see a Procrustean model where the patient is fitted to the background training or discipline of the practitioner, rather than the treatment being fitted to the underlying cause. So that's the general problem that we have in the ways in which people with depression are diagnosed and managed. When it becomes a young person, it becomes even more difficult. Firstly, adolescents are more likely to feel stigmatised by depression. They're less likely to want to talk about it, to open up. For the parents, it's difficult because they don't know whether their adolescent is going through some normative phase or whether, in fact, it's a clinical disorder and something needs to be done. And then, if the judgment is that something needs to be done, the difficulty is who to seek in terms of getting help. So what we sought to do in this book was to really say that it's a complicated story. It's a bit like a maze, and how can you navigate the maze? So what we're attempting to do tonight, and in this BrainFood series, that's the appetizer, we'll now move on to what I think in many ways is going to be the stimulus for our thinking, and that's to hear a presentation from Matthew Johnson. Matthew was an extremely successful advertising man, came back from America. He and I met. He had an idea about a book called I Had a Black Dog. It was eventually published. It has sold nearly 200,000 copies. A couple of years ago, it was the 6th highest selling book in the United Kingdom. And it is a brilliant book, a series of cartoons that goes to the heart of having a mood disorder, and it captures Matthew's story. I've heard some wonderful speakers around the world talk about their mood disorder, but I think Matthew is right up there, #1 position, not only because he can go to the heart of the issues, but he does so with empathy and ever positivity. So what we said to Matthew is, here's a book, please turn it into an educational program for us to roll out in secondary schools. And Matthew has slaved away for over a year, and what you're going to hear tonight is a cut-down version of that presentation that we will hope to roll out to Australian schools over the next few years. Matthew Johnson.
Thank you, Alumni Association, for having me here tonight. It's a great privilege and a great honour, and I'm going to talk about the Headstrong program, but before I started, I thought I'd start with a little poem just to get the ball rolling. It was given to me very kindly by someone, and it's called Inner Peace, and I have no idea who it was written by, but it says, if you can start your day without coffee, if you can always be cheerful, ignoring aches and pains, if you can resist complaining and boring people with your troubles, if you understand when your loved ones are too busy to give you any time, if you can take criticism and blame without resentment, if you can conquer tension without drugs, if you can relax without alcohol, if you can sleep without sleeping pills, well, you must be the family dog. And I say that because we're all human. We're only human. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm just going to go through the abridged version of Headstrong presentation, and this was developed over probably a year and a half. I illustrated it and came up with the concepts, and what's happened is we joined up with the Inspire Foundation, and we've turned this into curriculum. So what I'm showing you tonight is a very condensed version, because what we do in the schools is it goes from 6 to 8 classes. So there's a lot of feedback and projects and homework and all that sort of stuff and discussion groups. So we're very excited about it, and I hope you enjoy it. So as Gordon mentioned, the impetus for this book was from here. And so the thing that I love about this, and this is what I tell the kids, is that there are a lot of essays in this book written by teenagers. So even though the concepts are by me and the illustrations are me, the inspiration comes from teenagers themselves. So it's not someone sort of talking down to them, it's themselves talking to each other in many ways in a lateral sense. So what is it to be a teenager? I think all of us, and I have to caveat by what you're going to see tonight isn't just for teenagers. I think there is, as the cliche says, a little bit of something in this for everybody. So what is it to be a teenager? We all start off in life with hopes and dreams and things that we want to fulfill. Purpose, we want to live purposeful lives and to have jobs that have meaning and all that sort of stuff and have significant relationships. But along the way, we find significant pressures. And I just want to go through some of the pressures that teenagers especially face. The pressure of school, getting through HSC, getting through exams, getting into uni, finding a job. The pressure of peer pressure, just fitting in. Looking in a certain way and behaving in a certain way, keeping up with certain slangs and all that sort of stuff. The pressure of the media, as Gordon mentioned, I spent 15 years in advertising, and I'm really sorry for that. But, but pressure, the media does. I know the power of media and the effect that can have on people, especially, we see in young women how they feel about their body image and all that sort of stuff. We live in a country of, a drink and drug culture. Binge drinking and all that sort of stuff, and we're quite sort of unique in that sort of ways. I spent 8 years in America and I never saw it like we do here. I'm a Kiwi, we have the same sort of problem in New Zealand as well. And I think, it seems to be getting worse. The incidence of alcohol and drug-related violence are certainly getting up there, and I'm hoping that's going to change. There's also risk-taking, especially for young teen boys. We see this on our roads through P-platers and all that sort of stuff, and people taking terrible risks and all that sort of carry on. Now, technology is something that I'm a big fan of. I have my iPhone, I've got, we're getting an iPad, and I have several computers, and I think technology is quite brilliant, and what it has brought us is quite brilliant. Social networking, all that sort of stuff, but I also have found that it is also getting in the way of us talking on a face-to-face. We seem to be more disconnected than ever, and I especially think in our young people. The phenomenon of Facebook is quite incredible. One of the favourite sayings that I've heard of Facebook is it's not communicating, it's more broadcasting. And what's coming up is, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts about Facebook, and one of the things that's coming up is that people are becoming more unhappy because what they tend to see is a lot of other people having really good times, and they're not doing it themselves. And the other thing is, especially for young people, and I hear this time and time again, is the importance of having as many friends as possible. On any given day, you can only have about 150 people in your life. That's your work colleagues, your friends, your family, and anything beyond that is sort of superfluous. So, there's people with 3,000 friends on Facebook. It's sort of not quite real. And when I was growing up, and I'm sure when a lot of you were growing up, our parents could shield us from what we saw, what was going on in the world. Nowadays, it's open slather and you can see everything. And I think, the greatest content on the internet is porn. But there's also stuff just like war images and bullying is so often uploaded onto the internet. And I think we as humans, there are certain things that we just do not need to see. And I think that is having a profound effect on the worldview of our young. Bullying, as I just mentioned, it's not only verbal but also physical. There's also texting bullying, or there's sexting as well, which is becoming a big problem. And then there's sort of cyberbullying as well. And the terrible thing about cyberbullying is that once it goes up, it can't be taken down. And I'm a true believer that a lot of people act quite differently behind keyboards than they do face-to-face. So they sort of have a different personality. And then obviously there's sexual identification, how kids feel about themselves, that sort of awkward phase of hormones and pimples and other bits and pieces. Both for male and female can be quite a difficult time. And then there's the family. I think we all aspire to have the wooden top family, the cozy kind of family that gets on together and all that sort of stuff, but quite often it's not the case. We have quite high degrees of domestic violence in this country. There's also a lot of single parents and broken homes and all that sort of stuff. And that has a profound effect on people's worldview. So when you consider everything that a teenager has to face, it really is quite a lot, the pressures that they face. And then if you chuck a mood disorder on top of it, that's when life can become really quite perilous. So what are the telltale signs of a mood disorder? First of all, there's the loss of self-esteem. There's anxiety and irritability, just that pacing and never being able to sit still and relax, no matter how tired they are. Irritability and anger, that sort of flying off the handle, that hair trigger sort of reactionary sort of thing, which is not in keeping with what's really going on. I think this is probably one of the most important slides, the loss of joy. I think when we lose joy in life, we begin to question what the point of it is. It really is like that little drop of ink in the glass of water. It just sort of muddies everything. A hopelessness about the future, and if we look at world events at the moment, what's going on with the floods and the earthquakes and the nuclear meltdowns and everything, there's a lot more difficulties in the world as well in getting ahead, getting degrees, getting jobs, a lot more pressure. So there's a lot of that kind of, well, what's the point, But one of the things I really like to tell students is that, for everything that is bad, there is equal good, and bad can come of good. So I think it's really important to talk to our young people about the positive things in the world and the things that, the people that are doing good things. And then there's the wanting to eject or to pull out from things that are typically important, like not returning phone calls or emails, not turning up to sports, not turning up to clubs, sort of recessing back into their cave. And then there's crying, a little bit like the anger, which is not in keeping with what's really going on, that sort of uncontrollable crying or just sort of being upset all the time. And then there's ruminating thoughts, negative thinkings, that churning kind of grinding, wearing you down kind of negative thoughts, especially at night time, that is just totally exhausting, and that can quite often lead to insomnia. And insomnia, I think, is, when good sleep goes, everything that depends on that sleep goes out the door with it. It's your mood, it's your memory, it's your ability to get things done. It's just all that sort of stuff. It's sort of like starting the day with a couple of glasses of wine on your cornflakes. What I just want to recap on everything that I've said, all those things are quite normal. I think depression is a normal part of life. We all have our ups and downs. We have deaths in the family. We have things that happen to us, and it's all quite normal. But if you are feeling any of these things for 2 or 3 weeks, feeling any of these things for a lot of the time, for 2 or 3 weeks or more, you should definitely go and seek some sort of counsel, and because it's not normal. Facts and stats about mood disorders. People quite often feel like they're the only ones going through this. But the truth is, it's about 1 in 5 will experience a mood disorder in their lifetime, which is, quite a high degree of people in this room. 1 in 20 will experience some form of bipolar or a variant of bipolar in their lifetime. And I think if Gordon was to say anything, it's probably growing. And so, you probably know someone who has a mood disorder, and a lot of these people here, probably other than Princess Di, Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln, a lot of these people are actually living quite successful lives. So it's not to say that it's a death sentence or anything like that. We can get on and we can contribute to the community and keep going forward. Different types of mood disorders. This is according to the BDI model, which Gordon touched on before. There is melancholic depression, which is biochemical. Quite often melancholic depression requires chemicals because it's a chemical imbalance, so it needs a chemical maybe in the form of an antidepressant to rectify that imbalance. It is also hereditary, unfortunately. My mum had depression. I know it's quite sad, this slide, isn't it? My mum had it as well. It was a hormonal imbalance in those days, and my brother, who's a psychiatrist, he has bipolar, so it was very evident in my family. And then there's psychotic depression, which affects a very small amount of people, but is also quite a dangerous type of depression. And then bipolar, the oscillating highs and lows, which I'll touch on a little bit in a little while. And then there's non-melancholic depression, which is which is sort of taken on by outside stresses. So it could be, physical or mental abuse, a death in the family, heartbreak, a failure of some sort, or a breakup in the family, a significant breakup in the family can bring it on. And also stress, I think, is a very big precursor to depression. But this is probably treated a little bit differently through different therapies, and you might not need to go on antidepressants for that. Personality types that are at risk of non-melancholic depression. These are the self-critical, the person who's always putting themselves down, who can do no right. The perfectionist. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and it is an absolute bugger because nothing is as good as you expect. I do a lot of talks to professional sporting groups, to law firms, to big corporations, and I come across perfectionism all the time. And it can really bring you undone. And then the socially avoidant or the shy. Life can be very difficult for these people, just sort of getting on in life. And then if you've got a depression on top of that, it can make life very difficult. The self-absorbed, or as Gordon calls it, the hissy fitter, the person that's all about them. They're not very good at sort of taking on other people's points of view and so forth. And then there's the rejection sensitive. And I'm not just talking about love, but rejection sensitive in all regards. They can really affect, if they're not chosen for a team or partner play, whatever it is, they can really crush them and affect their worldview again. Bipolar disorders. This is one of my favourite slides. And basically this came from the book, and it said, if everyday people had 4-stroke engines for brains, people with bipolar have V8s. But they also have little wheels and cheap drum brakes, so they're all power and no stopping ability. They're all energy and they're all get up and go. They do a lot of reckless spending and sort of a lot of behaviour that is sort of out of the norm. And a lot of the time that we see with people with bipolar is that sort of high energy but then there's regret that follows afterwards because they kind of go, oh, what have I done? There's quite often talking over the top, talking loudly, saying inappropriate things. Quite often there's synchronicity with the universe and spiritual happenings. People writing the great novel, And the thing is, for a lot of people with bipolar, they actually enjoy the highs, because it's where they get a lot of the energy. Stephen Fry's talked about it quite openly. That's where he does his mojo. But the sad thing is, about people with bipolar is they're a little bit like a skyrocket. They kind of go up in the sky and they explode and they do beautiful stars and things in the sky. But what happens to a skyrocket? It runs out of gunpowder and then it falls to the ground. And this is obviously where people are at most critical when they have severe bipolar. Common coping strategies. Self-imposed solitary in the hope that it will pass. Putting on a show face. We have a mantra in this country which is, she'll be right. Putting a lot of energy into sort of fronting up and presenting something to the world that you expect people to see you as. Food, has a lot of relationships with mood. Some people eat for comfort and other people eat for control. And then quite often with bad feelings, there can be an attraction to bad company and bad habits. Again, we see this a lot with our teens. And then there's also the, self-harm and suicide. And suicide we call the permanent solution to a temporary problem. I think, suicide is a terrible thing for a lot of people because it leaves behind a terrible legacy for the families that are left behind, and a lot of questions why. I've had the privilege of working or talking with and being at events with a guy called Don Ritchie, who won the Australian Order of the Year. He's the old guy who lives at the Gap. He has saved, officially, 160 people's lives. And unofficially, it's more up there around about 350, 360 people. And he's an amazing old guy. He used to be a salesman, and he just did the simple thing of going out and asking if people are okay and if they wanted to come and have a cup of tea. And that to me proves that people just get stuck into these cyclones, these terrible storms of, they can't see any way out. And just that simple act of reaching out and asking if you're okay can save a life. So if there's one thing that any of you take away tonight is just if you're worried about someone, never be afraid to reach out. Fears of seeking help. We live in a very blokey nation. I do a lot of talks in the rural community, and in the country, you kind of play rugby or there's the pub, and there's not really a lot in between. And for a lot of guys, there's a lot of difficulty in actually putting your hand up and asking for help. And then there's the fear of being labelled. Labels are terrible things. People get labelled with all sorts of stuff and they stick. And then for school kids, there's the fear of, word will get out, that it'll be all over Facebook and all that sort of stuff. And then there's the fear of taking medication, obviously. and the fear of hospitalisation. All these things are quite legitimate, but they have to be taken in the context and talked through and understood. How do we get through the mental health maze? Well, when taking on a mood disorder, you alone can do it, but you can't do it on your own. You really need family and friends to back you up and support you. It's so important to have a close-knit group of people that can be there for you. But where do you go? Who do you talk to? There's so many possibilities over that wall. Probably the first place to go is Dr. Google or to the laptop for teenagers, because that's how they live their lives. And there is an absolute dearth of great information out there. There's the Black Dog Institute. Obviously, we have incredible PDFs and things that you can download, self-tests, Beyond Blue, Sane Australia. All these sort of websites, they all have fantastic information that is incredibly helpful. But for a teenager, we'd encourage them to go and talk to an elder that they look up to and they respect and they trust. And then obviously, if they can, go and see their family doctor with a family member, because a family member knows the history, they know the background, all that sort of stuff. From there, they could refer to a school counsellor, back to the school counsellor for some more guidance at school, a psychologist, obviously, and then a psychiatrist who can obviously administer medication or hospitalisation if they see fit. But I suppose the most important thing is to nip it in the bud early, because the longer it's left to go, the bigger it can come back. Now, if I was Barry O'Farrell for the day, I would seek that everyone goes and seeks some sort of counsel, because I think, the first immediate consultation that someone has with a counsellor or a therapist is one of the most important. And we all have our stories, we all have our issues, we all have our legacy that we want to share, but this particular relationship is so incredibly important. And a lot of people think that because they're going to see someone with a degree that they know everything, but they are just like anyone, and if it doesn't feel right, if you don't have this kind of relationship, if you don't feel engaged, or you have empathy or an understanding, or a plan to move forward, then it might not be right. It's just like any sort of relationship, and that you have the right to go and seek counsel elsewhere. So it's just finding the right fit is so incredibly important. It can make such a huge difference on a person's recovery. But the other thing is, what a lot of people don't realise is that a lot of the information or a lot of the aha moments or the insights come from us, not necessarily the doctor. If it's a good psychologist or psychiatrist, they'll be the conduit from coming to grips and understanding of what we're going through. Obviously, it's just better out than in. To share the stuff, it is just much more healthy to get it out. And obviously, for teenagers, it's really important to have confidentiality, to know that it's not going to be told and spread around. The importance of family in school. A lot of the problems that I see, in schools, there's a lot of denial in parents. There's sometimes a lot of shame, or there's a lot of ignorance in what's going on. For a kid, they need to know that if they're 16 and over, they can go and get their own Medicare card. They can go and see their own doctor, and they can go and get some referrals to go and see a psychologist. So this is all possible to them, and they don't need their parents' permission to do that. But obviously, in the best case scenario, as Gordon said, it's better if the family is there, or significant friends or whatever that can be there for the initial assessment, because it takes out a lot of the guesswork. And it also shows that person a lot of empathy and understanding and support. We encourage kids to seek out school counsellors. I actually think school counsellors have a slight stigma attached to them, because normally they're next to the headmaster's office. People come out of the headmaster's office and they go straight into the school counsellors. I think it'd be better if they were called life coaches or that sort of stuff, and they were put in a different part of the school. But they have a lot of worth that they can add. They are a lot of support, and they should be looked upon as a place of safe haven. We've got a guy at the Institute called Nick Newling, who's a wonderful guy, and he said when he was going through his mood disorders that one of the greatest things that his parents ever did for him was to tell the school. Because the school didn't understand what was going on. Nick was playing up, and once they knew how to cater stuff for him, that he could actually sit out of exams, or they could defer exams for him, or they could sit out of rugby, or that sort of stuff. And it just made such a huge difference to his learning experience. Again, if you are in trouble, if you are going through difficulty, there is absolutely no shame in putting your hand up and asking for help. The only shame is missing out on life. And again, if you are concerned about someone, if you are worried about someone, just reach out, because that simple act of kindness can turn a life around. It can even save a life. And that's it for this part of the equation, and I'm going to come back a little later on and talk about resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And just as an aside, he showed you a picture of some very famous people who'd had bipolar disorder, and you would have seen the picture of Winston Churchill. There's just been a book published by Jonathan Davidson that looks at the British Prime Ministers, at least the first 51 of them. He goes up to Tony Blair. Of those 51, 16% had a bipolar disorder, and Davidson makes the point, none of them lost office as a consequence of their bipolar disorder. And Britain was probably better served by the Prime Ministers that had a bipolar disorder than the Prime Ministers who were anxious and lacking in self-confidence. So I think it speaks to the message that depression shouldn't always bring you down, and that many people, in fact, are not scarred in the flame, but they develop resilience. And Matthew will come back for 5 minutes at the end to give the other side of this story in terms of some messages about resilience. Could I now ask our two other guests up, Lucy Napper and Ian Hickie, and I'll briefly introduce them. Lucy is one of the many ambassadors that we are blessed with at the Black Dog Institute, people who volunteer to talk about their mood disorder and do so with great openness and allow an understanding for people who, as all of us do, find difficulty in trying to understand the complexities of mood disorders. Importantly, she is a lawyer, and I emphasise that issue because for two reasons. One is there was a survey in Australia a few years ago, the Beatson survey, that identified lawyers as being the professional group with the highest rate of mood disorders. Luckily, they didn't include doctors in that survey, so we don't know how we would have comparatively ranked. So Lucy is going to talk openly about some aspects of her mood disorder. Ian Hickie is from the Brain and Mind Institute, where he's the executive director. Ian is a ball of energy. He has set up so many differing organisations with tremendous imagination and energy. That includes being the initial executive director for Beyond Blue, then coming back to Sydney with the Brain and Mind Institute. He has done so much to challenge politicians and to make sure that mental health is centre stage. And there was a survey late last year that looked at the public's priorities of issues that they would want politicians to address. And mental health was number 3. And I think Ian has led the way in many ways. He's not the Minister for Health at this stage. He's not the shadow Minister for Health, but he shadows Ministers for Health, acting like Jiminy Cricket. So we're going to have a few questions from me to get it going, and then, as I said earlier, I will invite the audience. But Ian, the first few slides of Matthew's presentation, all the pressures on adolescents, do you think that there are any more pressures these days that might account for the seeming increase in depression, or has it always been so?
I think if we study rates of depression, you can say there is increased reporting of depression. I don't think the social stresses argument per se. I think the other side of the coin, I think there's better evidence for less social support. So I think the issue about how you cope with that transitional period and the degree of support that you receive, and I think in a lot of work we're associated with, that peer support is there, a lot of contact with friends for a lot of people, although you may get more isolated through experiences like anxiety and depression. But support from others, more mentoring, more cross-generational support, more engagement with the community sector isn't there. And I think Facebook is such a fascinating thing because I think it is young people's response to social disconnection has been to use technology to create connection. And we're left with that argument, is the connection the same? You know, what are the nature of those friendships? What's the nature of that interaction? But I do think there's a substantive argument that since the end of the Second World War, the social factor that has changed the most, that has contributed, particularly in Western societies, to the higher rates of reporting depression in young people, is decreasing social connection in the face of everything else that you then have to deal with through that period. I think the nature of the stresses has changed, but I think, you know, if you talk to people across previous generations, young people have always faced a series of difficult transitional issues, but probably did that within more supportive communities, families, local meaningful networks with more models of how to cope with those particular sets of stresses they face and less disconnection than we now face.
Thanks, Ian. Maybe a second question to you at this stage. When you watched Matthew's presentation, what were the issues that resonated most with you?
Well, I think I've got a slightly different take, as you know, on the depression thing. I think that the key thing is that recognition thing. I think no matter how you conceptualise depression, I think particularly in the teenage period, I think it is the signal kind of pathway condition. Wherever else you're headed, if you're into serious trouble, then the recognition of depression, and I think the issue of persistence. You know, people say, well, you know, of course there are changes in behaviour. We all see changes in behaviour, and we all have bad days, and we can apparently be irritable from day to day and perhaps not be as sociable as we normally would be. So that issue of persistence, I think, is really important, because it's quite different to the usual medical kind of idea that if you complete a checklist or if you complete a test, you've got something or not. But actually that persistence, and I think we undersell or poorly communicate the extent to which persistence is associated with impairment. And that, you know, really friends and family and those people who do know you well do recognise that if you're like that for a while, you go badly at school, you withdraw from your friends, you don't cope. And it's that persistence with impairment that I think we've got to communicate much more actively as the trigger to help seeking.
Just to editorialise there, it's important to note that we all get depressed. If you give a definition of depression to somebody, do you ever feel depressed, have a drop in your self-esteem, feel self-critical, feel hopeless and helpless, feel like giving up? 98% of the population will say, yea, verily. However, and probably 4 to 6 times a year, most people, when you ask how long those episodes last, will say minutes, hours, or a couple of days. And then it spontaneously remits, or the Waratahs eventually win, or something like that. And that's the normal response. So there is a condition that you can call sadness, normative depression. Ian's emphasis on persistence and the way in which it's operationalised in the classificatory systems is, as Matthew pointed out, is usually to impose a period of 2 weeks. So persistence is a good flag for clinical depression.
Yep.
Lucy, would you like to give the audience some overview of your story in the sense of, did depression come flashing out one day with a big D saying, this is depression? Did it creep up on you slowly? How did it present for you, and did you appreciate what was happening?
Gordon, I think in retrospect, I can say it did happen quite suddenly. When I was 18 and I went through the transition from high school to university, I think that I probably did find that quite dislocating, and my depression came on quite suddenly. But at the time, I didn't recognise it for what it was. I had no idea that I was going through anything that might be conceived of as an illness. I just thought I wasn't very good at handling anything really that I wasn't handling. I wasn't being a good student. I wasn't being a good friend, a good daughter, a good person. And it took over 2.5 years for me to reach a point, and my family and my friends to reach a point where I could acknowledge and seek external help. And once I did manage to do that with my family support, to go to our family GP, who was wonderful, and explain to her what had happened, and then she referred me on to a psychiatrist, Dr. Lisa Jukes, who was also wonderful. And from that, my recovery was quite smooth. But reaching that stage was really difficult and dark, because I had no idea what I was going through.
Were there any slides from Matthew's presentation that you resonated with?
Yeah, absolutely. Picking up on what Ian was saying, actually, the two themes for me that were the most significant were, firstly, isolation, and secondly, persistence. So Matt's slide that had the eject button and the person trying to sort of escape from their life, that was my overwhelming experience, was a desire to withdraw. Was a desire to withdraw from everything that I had previously engaged with, and also a complete incapacity to connect. So it was this isolation that I not only felt had been imposed on me, but that I was continuing to perpetuate because I didn't know how to break away from it. And that may be, as Ian said, due to the weaker sort of social connections that we have, these days, or that I had when I was, 18 or 19. But having said that, I have a wonderful family, and I went to a lovely school and had great friends and achieved, and there was nothing in particular that suggested that there would be anything that should trigger a mood disorder with me. And I think that because 6 or 7 years ago when this all developed, there were no presentations like this. There were not many books like yours that were available generally to high school students. There wasn't a lot of discussion in the general community. So I never triggered that there could be anything wrong with me that I hadn't somehow brought on myself.
So the first thing was to become very insular, stay in your room, not reply to phones, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Did you think that was depression, or did you think there was something else explaining that insularity?
No, I think I had always been, I had a tendency to be quiet and a little bit shy, and I just sort of assumed that I was under pressure with starting uni and undertaking my law degree and having normal kind of adolescent, maybe belated adolescent kind of hormonal things. And I really honestly just thought that it was me, and that I was ungrateful, or a selfish modern child who had been mollycoddled and couldn't kind of deal with reality. And it honestly just never occurred to me it would be something more than that.
So the self-blame accrued.
Yeah.
You were continuing to be critical of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did people around you notice loss of light in the eyes or other signals?
I'm sure they did, but I think, and this is also another of Matthew's slides, is that you get very good at putting on a face. And I was good at that at uni with my friends, with superficial relationships. I actually found quite easy, as long as everything was kept on the surface, to engage with people superficially. So it was really, the people I think it most affected was my family and my very close friends, because they knew me well enough and under enough circumstances to see that I couldn't always maintain that, and I didn't always have the energy to put on this face. But when they said to me, and they did many, many times, are you okay? I would always just say yes, because I didn't know how to say, no, I'm not okay, but I don't know what is wrong with me.
Right. So there was this nebulous feeling that I'm not okay. How did you get closer to the diagnosis, the definition of depression as against anything else?
Yeah, well, what happened was, as I said, it was a long time coming, and it was several years. And actually, I went overseas for 4 or 6 weeks, and I think that break away from my life and my reality somehow triggered something. And when I came home, I said to my mum, I think there's something wrong with me, and I don't think I can fix it. And that was a huge thing for me to be able to say. It seems so minor, but it was massive. And as soon as I said that, Mum took me to our family GP and said, okay, we're going to fix this, we're going to get help. And we did.
So what caused that change in your thinking? Had somebody said something, or read something?
No, I think it was just the break of being out of my normal routine, away from all my normal stresses, and still feeling awful all the time, and still being being away and unable to connect with anything, anywhere, seeing wonderful sights, having great food, having a good time, having no pressure, and nothing. There was no engagement, there was no emotional connection.
If somebody had come up to you before then and said, in an intrusive way, I think you're depressed, how would you have responded to that?
That's interesting, Gordon. I don't know. I think I probably would have, on some level, acknowledged that to be possible, but I didn't know anything about depression. To me, as a 19, 20-year-old law student, depression was something that people got when they were abused or drug addicts or had some extremely traumatic experience, had grown up in a war zone. It wasn't something that someone as lucky as me could develop. I think I would have considered it almost self-indulgent to consider that I had a mood disorder on par with people who had these awful experiences.
I think that says a lot about you and your great character and resilience to make that statement. Ian, how common is Lucy's story, or is that very unusual? Does that show a lot of sophistication compared to the average young person?
Well, the sophisticated bit is to realise that it's wrong, you know, there's something really profoundly wrong. I think the question about if someone says, "Are you okay?" a bit from Matthew's book I probably might disagree with a bit. Anyone says, "Are you okay?" you can say, "Yeah, of course I'm okay." You know, they're kind of offering help, but the kind of immediate response is actually not to do that. So I think we've got to find different ways of engaging around that topic of how you provide help, and then what help is like, and where that pathway of getting help starts. I mean, I think we have a number of significant advantages or advances now. One is the one you've alluded to, the much wider concern in Australia about mental health. So
mental health.
Yeah, there's a much wider discussion across the whole community about mental health. So the anxiety now, which was in the international survey, is about how the hell do you get help? You know, it's not so much about having the problem now, it's about the accessibility of help. With young people in particular, this is where I think where the internet has been a major advance, about ways of actually engaging, getting information, as you alluded to, things like the Inspire Foundation that Matthew's been working with, the way in which the internet is being used now, are ways of entering into, starting to find out more, starting to get information, even trying strategies online, getting information. And we have seen developments in the health services systems, the things like the Headspace movement in Australia and others, of trying in some way to make that gap between some recognition that something is wrong, and I think what Matthew was alluding to, the easy entry point, being able to talk to someone in some way, whereas I think we've previously had this big gap between you identify a problem and it's the family GP or it's the health system, a very adult focused, a very medicalised kind of thing that is a long way away. And so it's hard if, I think in that conversation when someone says, "Are you okay?" if at the same time you're thinking, if I'm not okay, what happens next? You know, because that next has been such an alienating experience. And primarily in Australia, the primary care system is unfriendly to the young. It's great if you're middle-aged, you know, doctors the same age as you are and who are suffering the same complaints together, it's marvellous. But, you know, when you're young and you're not, it's a different kind of system. And so I think there's a real challenge as we head down the public education kind of road, that actually these easy entry points, the sort of soft way of having that conversation, but I think also at a family level and at a school level, we've got to ask the questions in a different way. I don't think, "Are you okay?" That's the meaning of the question, but I don't think it is actually the question. There's a way of sort of seeking information together, working in a different kind of way, and actually, for the people you're really close to, you just know they're not okay. So I think the issue becomes how do you assist, how do you start that conversation? I'd be interested in what you think, Lucy, about how you actually do that. You know, like,
Yeah.
And I think it's this, in the work we've been doing with young people and with Inspire and elsewhere, it's trying to find a different language or way of behaving that allows people to start down that process. I think the evidence is pretty good. Once you start down that road and accompany people down that road, they'll get help. But the start is still really, really difficult.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think that, I mean, this is only my experience, and I don't pretend to speak for all young people, but I certainly know that in general, quite often young people need not someone to say, "Are you okay?" but to say, "You're not okay."
Yeah.
Someone who they are close to and can trust. It's a parent or a friend or a counsellor or someone to say, "You know what? You're not okay. There's something wrong. We need to fix it. We can fix it. We will fix it. And these are some of the things that we're going to start to do in order to get that ball rolling." Because young people, in the midst of all, as Matthew pointed out, all these different pressures and a mood disorder as well, are overwhelmed by the question, as Ian said, "Are you okay?" And then the possible implications of, "No, I'm not, and now I need to tell you what I want to do and what's wrong with me," and which they're just not capable of doing. I certainly wasn't capable.
Matthew, you and your wife Ainsley wrote a book about how to help, and you have a number of slides about the things you should not do and some things you should do, like pull up your socks, etc. So would you like to summarise some of the things that are probably unwise, unhelpful, counterproductive, and some of the productive things?
Pointing out weather, how nice the weather is annoying and pointless. Socks have very little to do with mental health. Be a man, which is one that we came across quite a lot. You know, it's not a sign of weakness. All these sort of things. And I think, there's a lot of sort of negative things that you can say. And I think, it's quite a hard thing when you're sort of saying how you actually approach the subject, because a lot of people are fearful of approaching people's mental health or lack of it. And how do you actually step over that thing? And quite often, I think, if someone says you're not okay, it's also a validation of what they're experiencing as well. So what they can see and how you might be affecting that family unit or, your partner or whoever it is. So it's important for that person to be able to say what it is. But I think sometimes it's always very difficult to hear and also to be able to respond to it, if you're okay, or how do you actually start that dialogue. Some of the good things that you can do is just to say, this is what I've become aware of, this is how you're making the rest of us feel, but also trying to be there and not being an armchair general and telling someone how they should be living or how they should be behaving, but really trying to be there and listen to them. Like I have an expression which is like being the rock in the river, where you let it flow around you and just open your ears, shut your mouth and open your heart and really listen there. And then if that person says they think they need help like you did, then help them find that help. Do some research on a good doctor, and then go with them is one of the greatest things that you can do as an act of support.
Thank you. I want to pursue the issue of how to get help, but it is now time to open it up to the audience, and that question may come up. If it doesn't, I will insert it somewhere. Can we seek questions from the audience?
It seems that there's a general recognition that one of the problems is awareness in the individual and awareness in those people immediately close to them. And one of the problems appears to be a disposition to label and the misleading nature of labels. I think that you mentioned there's a tendency to bring the prejudices of the professional treating person, and that will determine the label given. So it just occurred to me that maybe a focus on symptoms might be a better way forward. And two of the things that you seem to have identified were isolation and persistence of symptoms. So maybe approaching it in terms of, you're not okay if it continues and if you're feeling, as opposed to, are you depressed? Do you have a mood disorder? Somehow it seems to me from what's being said that the readiness to label might be actually distancing people, both in terms of stigmatisation and in terms of the confusion as to what that label means. Does it mean I'm having a bad day? Or does it mean, I've got a serious problem and I need help? So that occurred to me as being perhaps a more productive way to approach the exercise.
That's a lovely comment. Would anyone like to respond to that?
Well, I think one of the key issues for family and everyone, when you've got family, you've got people who care, is to comment on that things have changed. People can observe change, right? So you're not going out so much, you're not engaged, you're not as much fun, you're not doing whatever. So, and someone legitimately close to you comments on change. That's one aspect. I think the label thing is really hard because people do tend to give their own explanatory model, as Gordon was saying. Is it because you're under the HSC? Is it because of this? Is it because your friends are no good? Blah, blah, blah. While the labels are not easy, intrinsically the implication is that seeking healthcare is an appropriate thing to do. So somewhere in the conversation, even if you avoid the label, even if you don't, in a sense, a good thing I think to is to avoid a label, or there's no one suggesting people should engage in sort of random diagnostic practices, But the key is the communication's got to be at some point, can we sort this out together, or are we going to go and get help? And help meaning healthcare. So in a lot of the discussions we have with young people, I think also there's a degree of frankness. We kind of do sort of skate around and we don't want to label and all that kind of stuff, almost to the point we don't know what we're talking about. And we've had a lot of discussion of this in the Headspace movement. No, you can't, promote a mental health service. People won't come because they'll be stigmatised amongst young people. We've had exactly the opposite experience. They go, oh yeah, it is a mental health service. Okay, that's where I'm going. That's the nature of the problem. It's not another problem, and fearful that the ordinary traditional GP system will miss it because it's not a mental health care system. So the labelling issue, is a complicated one. But beyond just commenting about symptoms or commenting about change, the key communication from those who understand the healthcare system is a communication that maybe it's a healthcare problem. So maybe we've got to go and find out from someone or some system or somewhere that knows if that's the appropriate response.
So it may be that strategy is a good one for opening up a conversation and encouraging somebody to seek help. But I would put to you that it is not a good idea to continue on that nebulous way. I occasionally will see somebody who's seen a professional for 5 years, 10 years, once a week, and I'll say, what's the game plan? And I'll hear, well, we haven't got round to that yet. Or what's the diagnosis? Well, I think they said major depression or something. So Lucy, in response to the questioner, would that have been useful, a gentle, encouraging way for you to get help? When you got to help, how important was it for you to get a definite statement that this is depression as against anxiety and an explanation?
Yeah, it was incredibly important for me. I remember quite clearly the day I was diagnosed, and I consider it to be one of the best days of my life because it was the beginning of the end for me of all the the awful things that go with depression. But it was also, in some sense, a huge relief because no longer was the pressure on me to figure out which particular aspects of my personality were contributing to different things, or what I was doing wrong to create certain things. There was a professional, there was a diagnosis, there was a treatment plan, and it was an enormous relief to be able to sort of sit back and say, okay, this is now out of my hands to a significant extent, and I can trust that the mental health professionals will be able to guide me in what to do from here. So it was incredibly important.
Thank you. The next question was up the back.
For teenagers who just have normal levels of the normal stresses, as well as those who may have mood disorder on top of those, what are the key principles, say 3 key principles around resilience and 3 practical tips to help build resilience in teenagers?
I'm going to ask Matthew not to reply now because he'll pick it up, but maybe Ian.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of resilience, to tell you the truth. Because on the one hand, I think, and this relates to a previous Prime Minister who's no longer the Prime Minister, there's this idea that for people who are resilient, everyone else should be. And that somehow if you could make everyone bulletproof, then you wouldn't have depression, kind of idea. Whereas I think, in fact, the more difficulties you have and the more you have an experience like depression and whatever else, the more important it becomes to actually develop resilience, develop coping strategies, develop ways in which you cope with the profound effect of these sort of problems on your life. So if that's what you mean by resilience, then I think that's a really important concept, because it is the not going for the final solution to a temporary problem, which is otherwise, on particular days, an overwhelming set of issues. But I get a bit worried that resilience gets promoted more widely in the community, particularly by people who've never had such experiences. People should just be more bulletproof. And I'm not sure where Matthew's going to go later on. But I think in that sense, I'd rather see an emphasis on we all learn more coping strategies. We all have bad days, we all have these issues. What are the sort of things we all can do that help us to cope better with all of these stresses that we always face in life? Rather than, in a sense, I think individual resilience gets promoted as yet another thing to seek, to have, almost in a consumerist kind of way. Perhaps
Thanks.
not a very popular view at the moment, but anyway.
Thank you. There's a question coming up in the middle of this row, and then we'll come to the 4th row of chairs on the end.
Yes, Ian. With regard to the health system, what role do you see for psychiatric nurses? And in particular, do you see a bigger role for them to help with this overload of everything?
My personal favourite, psychiatric nurses, mental health nurses with mental health training. In fact, you'll see a document come out tomorrow, hopefully, and chasing around those health ministers, Gordon, about saying one of the workforces that we've really not done a great job with and failed to utilise more effectively are nurses throughout the health system, and then particularly nurses with more mental health expertise. In the completely inexplicable world of healthcare politics and the way we structure the healthcare system in Australia, nurses have been relatively neglected relative to the other professions. And certainly as people move into more chronic and persistent and the more severe illness spectrums in all the disorders that we treat, we have a really big job in front of us to find effective ways to use nurses at all levels, whether that be in the antenatal, postnatal period, it's in child health, it's in the school system, and a whole lot of other sets of systems. So It's one of the areas in which we have endless discussions. And then I've got to say, there are a series of professional issues in nursing, there are issues in the universities and higher education systems, and there are issues in the employment systems to date have mitigated against, in my view, the effective use of nurses.
Lady here, thank you.
My husband died because of depression, and I have one son who also suffers bipolar. And I, as a mother, have been told that a lot of it is genetic, and the genes, it comes from the mother. How much depression or bipolar do you think is hereditary or through the genes?
Ian, would you like to?
Well, just that gender one. Just last week I heard a terrible story from a friend I know forever whose father had bipolar disorder, and she had been told by a doctor that the genes for bipolar disorder ran only through fathers. You know, and I think what it tells you is there is more misinformation than there is information in the area. So I think what we understand are a lot of the what are called population genetics. We know about the risk as it is averaged across families. So we certainly know, as Gordon was alluding to and as Matthew showed, a lot of people will run into the disorders we're talking about because they have strong genetic loads. They have risks. Then there is stuff that happens in their life. So I think the way we best understand genes at the moment is they constitute significant risks. That doesn't mean they are inevitably inherited in any simple Mendelian or traditional way that we understand. Many years later, I don't know, Gordon, when the first set of bipolar genes were described in the Amish in the US in the 1980s, it was a very famous thing on World Today, end of psychiatry, genes discovered, you know, kind of thing. I think we're still in business, you know, 30 years later, and we still are not that close. In fact, the big, what are called genome-wide association studies, the big world studies are putting all together, all the big groups, have still not identified really solid single genes that we can trace. So we know genetics, the way things run in families, are very important. We're yet to understand how that is. We certainly don't, there's nothing even remotely like it runs down the maternal line or the paternal line, or at this stage simply predicting. I think the thing is to know what is in your family. I always use the analogy of patients I'm talking to. In my family, you get blue eyes, that's very nice, but you get risk to diabetes too. You get the risk. So in my family, you get a little bit overweight, you under-exercise, you get diabetes. You know, I know that about that, therefore I can make adjustments in relation to that. The saddest story I think I ever heard in psychiatry from a patient was a patient with a very severe postnatal depression whose mother had been in a psychiatric hospital for 3 years after her own birth. But she'd never told her daughter that. And no one in the family had ever told her that. So no one knew in the obstetric system, no one knew in the family system. Her mother ended up telling her after she was hospitalised for very severe postnatal depression herself and almost killed herself.
If she knew that, how would she prepare for that?
Well, it's not just that she prepares, it's that everybody knows. It's one of those things. In our family, you're more likely, if you're facing this particular event, to have that particular thing. And so you've got a healthcare system. You've got, in that case, potentially a husband, others who know. And so if things were different, and some issues about dealing with the changes in sleep-wake patterns after the birth, dealing with other sets of issues, you know, greater support. Just like if you say you've got a family history of cancer or heart disease, or people can get engaged with that, people in your life, plus the healthcare system, rather than being blind to something terrible happening until the effects are kind of felt. So I think what we know about psychiatric genetics at the moment, certainly in families like bipolar disorder, is talk about the significantly increased risk. That doesn't mean all of your offspring, and certainly not in any predictable way. And we know issues about periods of risk. So I think the really good thing about this thing this evening is increasingly what we know is that the risk periods for onset of all of the major adult disorders are in this late teenage and early adult period. So I think at that particular period of life, if you've got a family history and you've got a teenager in trouble, that's the period to get help. And if you know that about your family, and if your family's had good experiences with care and not tragic experiences, hopefully you would be more willing to go get care.
The question I have, it actually probably follows on from your last comment. During that adolescent period, we've heard so far that the identification of depression has been quite mild. But there is the opposite side of it where it's not quiet, it's actually quite violent, where there's lashing out by those that may suffer depression, intimidation. I think on the slides we saw earlier there were examples of gravitating towards the bad element. There's also, it's all about me. The thing which I'd like you to comment on is where there is that abusive nature, not by the parents, but by the adolescent towards the parent, because they're seeking counsel from people outside. My parents don't like me. And as a consequence, they're saying, well, parents are like that. And so rather than having the opportunity to be able to engage your adolescent to seek appropriate treatment, in fact, it becomes a never-ending abuse trail from the adolescent because not so much they don't want to seek help, but I could insert a lot of expletives about how they feel about their parents.
I guess we'll get Ian again, I think, to comment on that issue of irritability, anger, violence, and antipathy to seeking help.
Well, this is one of the biggest challenges we face. There's an assumption, as the story Lucy was doing, that at some point you have to decide you are the problem and to accept help. You know, not many men I know are very like that at any stage in their life, and particularly not when they're in trouble and they're kind of suffering in a particular way. So I think we have a lot of difficulty at the moment. Just look at the statistics. You know, for young men under the age of 25, only 13% in any year who have a mental health problem get any help at all, and it's about 30% for young women. So we completely don't have any systems that effectively engage young men, not in the formal healthcare system. So I think this is one of the greatest challenges, because families find themselves in this situation, schools find themselves in this situation, and the usual response is, of course, of exclusion or of increasing alcohol and drug use or of other sets of problems. And then, of course, the additional problems of not completing school or not completing education or not being in employment. And frankly, then you see in the city populations, of course, homelessness and other problems subsequently arise. So I think this is the most difficult problem, in fact. I think in a lot of other areas we are finding better solutions through internet, through peer issues, through changing health systems. I think an issue of engaging with young men in trouble where there are driving problems and simply not saying it's bad behaviour, you know, and they must just get it under control, which is, of course, the traditional kind of response. It comes back, I guess, to why I was making a fuss about social support. I think this is where the mentoring issue, about the access to other men, to ways of trying to transact that situation when families are not on their own or single parents are not on their own, school environments that can actually respond in more appropriate ways is really important. Just to give you an example, the Headspace service we run at Campbelltown, Father Chris Riley runs a kind of service down the road, right, picking up lots of kids off the street, mainly young men. And a large proportion of those guys settle down just in good social structures. But a significant proportion don't. And his biggest complaint has been lack of access to assessment services. He'll provide the social structure and some containment, a kind of Boys Town of the modern age rather than the old age. But within that then, you've got to link health services to that. So I think in ordinary families and ordinary schools, we've got to do the same thing. Rather than seeing young men always as the problem, got to just stop and think, you know, to what extent may there be other issues that could be addressed, and then find a way of transacting that. And I frankly think we need more social structures to assist us with that, rather than saying to those young guys, you'll have to get it in trouble and then you'll have to decide to come to care.
Yeah. I think there are two subpopulations of the subset that you describe. People who are intrinsically bolshy, act out, stress, externalise and so on. And there's another subset of people who only when depressed become extremely irritable and angry. And that's actually a sizable group. And many of them are highly embarrassed about it. They say, I'm really embarrassed that I'm being scratchy and irritable and crabby towards my husband, my wife, my children. So I think there are two subsets in answer to your question. Next one.
How to help the adolescents in preventing depression rather than waiting for depression to hit them and then try to help them, maybe to educate them in some lifestyle or attitude or any way to prepare them to diagnose themselves if they are getting close to depression.
Psychiatry prevention doesn't have a good track record.
I can say, do you want to take the rap for that one?
There are a number of studies looking at those at high risk who have a genetic diathesis and trying to see whether there are early signals. But there are some non-biological conditions where early intervention is quite powerful. For instance, children that show so-called behavioural inhibition, who are incredibly shy. If they are unassisted, they're at high risk of developing anxiety and depression. Behavioural intervention that makes them more assertive and stand up for their rights has been shown quite convincingly to be of benefit. So I think there's a horses and courses model where for some conditions you can intervene and provide some resilience, and for other conditions at this stage the evidence doesn't support it. But I suppose this is where psychiatry and the resilience positive psychology movement have some capacity to come together. The concept of building up resilience in general. And as you may know, Geelong Grammar has spent $18 million building a wellbeing centre, which is mainly structural, but certainly has Marty Seligman involved in programs to build up resilience, build to optimisation, and so on and so forth. Any other panellists like to comment on how we might be able to prevent people developing depression?
You said the key thing, Gordon. The evidence around prevention is relatively weak. The evidence around early intervention is quite strong. So, you know, what you're trying to get is least impact on your life. And if there isn't a simple set of preventative strategies, I mean, we know about some broad issues, you know, like reducing childhood abuse. We know about, you know, certain kind of things about reducing alcohol and drug use. We know about socialisation. But they're very broad sort of effects. What we actually know is early intervention, and I think Gordon's identified the ones we know about most. If you've got one of the earlier states that's more identifiable in childhood or in early adolescence, so you've got childhood anxiety, or you've got social inhibition or social anxiety, or you've got, you know, other kind of mood instability earlier on, then that evidence about intervening earlier to change course is much stronger. So it's kind of an interesting idea, you know, like in many areas of health, people go, oh, prevention, fabulous, based on vaccine ideas. You know, vaccines are quite unique in the rest of medicine. The rest of medicine really thrives on if you get in early and change something, you much reduce the impact. And often the strategies that you use are much simpler. So a lot of the debate that we see, you know, a lot of earlier use of appropriate psychological strategies, earlier social support, earlier lifestyle adjustments, earlier changes in sleep-wake cycles may abort a depressive episode much earlier. You know, and that may well be the most effective strategy currently available, while we try and figure out the multiple other pathways that constitute the range of depressive disorders that we're trying to describe, and hopefully some will be preventable. But I think there's a more urgent agenda, which is actually an early intervention agenda.
Two comments. One is CBT is a very effective psychological therapy for many people with anxiety and depression. Very effective, evidence-based therapy. There have been 6 studies of it applied to school children in Australia across the board. Compared to placebo, no benefit, nothing at all. So if we try to conceptualise population-based strategies as being prophylactic or preventive, it's highly unlikely. But to address the second point I think that Ian touched on, maybe the best thing that we can do is, again, to address the issue that Lucy's focused on. How do we reduce the time of once a mood disorder comes on to people getting help and making them feel more comfortable about getting help? We hear a lot in Australia about the high suicide rate, particularly in young males. It's important to note that while the statistics have been challenged a little bit, but the evidence has shown that in the last decade, the rates in young males has dropped from 40 per 100,000 to 18 per 100,000. And they've actually dropped across all age groups and across both genders. Why is it so? Well, probably for some specific reasons, but my personal view is that destigmatisation is probably the central issue, because it encourages people to feel more comfortable about getting help. And I think that's really Ian's point, that if we can't prevent depression, then we need to get people, when they've got the signals, getting assessed and getting help as fast as possible. There was a question here. Yeah. Maybe we'll make these the last two questions and then we're going to hear about resilience and whether you should believe in it or not. Thank you.
I think we don't know anything about medicine in our family, but the first person you would go to is the GP. And so I would urge people to consider that that is a primary point of contact for most ordinary families. Even if it might seem to be a mental health problem, going to the doctor seems to be what one does. And I just want to pay tribute today to Dr. Lynn Dowd, who has been killed in South Africa by lightning. And the Herald reported today, and that wonderful woman pointed our beautiful daughter in the way of excellent health. So I do think GPs are critical in this, but I just wanted to publicly thank her, even though she's not.
What a nice tribute on a very difficult day. Yeah. Any of you like to comment? It is the most common thing suggested. If depressed, go see your GP. I mean, I personally have a few caveats. Some GPs are totally uninterested in depression, and therefore it could be counterproductive. We've also done studies showing major differences between male and female GPs. Average male GP spends 6 minutes, average female GP spends 20 minutes. And female GPs are much more conscientious, I suppose in general, but certainly in terms of assessing people. So should it always be GPs, or what are the other options? And this, I think, is really the key issue. If you have an adolescent who's depressed, who should you turn to? Who would like to kick off?
This is one of my favourite topics, okay? Having spent about 10 years of my life totally promoting family GPs as the solution to almost every mental health problem, you know, it works if you are engaged or your family is engaged with a good family doctor, right? Then it works. And since the advent of MBS or Medicare-based support for psychological services for those who get in, it's got better. But if you go look at the so in that sense, if you fit the bill and your family fits the bill, it's great. And with the expansion of psychological services working in partnership with doctors, it's got better. The problem is if you don't fit. And a lot of young people don't fit. So what you see is in younger teenagers, more likely to use the GP, and if you've got a GP yourself, women much more likely, young women use GPs much more than young men, but there's a critical age period, and the trouble is the critical age period from about 16 to 25 is the period of least engagement for either young men or young women with their GP. They don't really have a family GP in that sense, unless their family negotiates it. So I'd say there's two things. We strongly encourage in all the work we're doing with young people is for families to take exactly the step you took. Right? In fact, a lot of marketing of mental health to young people that ignores their family really annoys me a lot, because really it's usually a parent or a friend or somebody else who transacts the system. And if the system you can make work as the GP one, great. But I think what we've come to realise, we've got to have a series of other systems as well. We've got to have more walk-in sort of systems based on what happened in the old family planning movements, sort of sexual health things where people can go if they want to go. We've got to make use of new technologies, particularly the internet, where young people do go and they share and they start to look at those. And many of the internet things like Mood Gym that Helen Christian runs or Inspire Foundation, they encourage people then if they're not doing okay or the problem persists to use their healthcare system. You know, school counsellors, other sets of systems. I'm glad to see David here from the universities. One of my favourite topics is the way in which universities or higher education systems really need to be engaged in this particular kind of area, that they're acquiring people during this period of life, when brain development is actually still going on. They're not as bright as they're going to be. You know, they actually need to be engaged during that critical period. So the GP bit is the bit, but we've tended to put all our eggs in that basket in the Australian healthcare system. And it works pretty well now if you're older. But at this point, if we're going to go down the early intervention path, we've got to have more responsive systems. We've got to recognise the fact that sometimes there's good fit and bad fit, and we need a range of other easier alternatives. We've been able to show with the sort of headspace services and other sort of soft entry kind of points, higher use by young men and much higher rates of self-referral, much higher rates of people coming in, or not just self-referral, but friend-precipitated referral. Not everyone has fabulous parents and families and others, but a lot of young people have peers. And if they know that they can use those systems too, then they will, you know, start to do that. So I think it's a sort of many doors, and they will be different. Certainly, I didn't mean to disparage GPs. I mean, GPs have been at the heart and soul of really the effective treatment of depression, and a lot of the destigmatisation has been because more people have got better care, and that's largely been through the general practice networks. But if the young people issue is going to take off, we've got to recognise we've got to fund and support a variety of other systems. And I think, just like we're doing at the workplace in older people, I think the higher education environment and the post-school training environments are critical. Pat McGorry, our Australian of the Year last year, I think made a critical point. You know, we put all this money and effort into social scaffolding at school to get everyone to get to be 17, 18 out the end of the HSC as if suddenly they're cured. In fact, they're abandoned at that point. There's a lot of structure in schools provided, but at the point that people most need it, the sort of 17, 18, 19, or if you're out of school 16, there's no social scaffolding. And, you know, that combination of social scaffolding needs to be in education and in training, as well as having very accessible. So we're starting to experiment with how do you put the health system into the education system? Like, how do you put it there in some meaningful way, like with adult populations, we're trying to put it in the workplace. So that particularly, about half the audience, men in particular might find it just a little easier to actually seek care in the setting where they go every day anyway.
One of the things that Kerry Ayres and I tried to do in the book was to write a chapter on how can you tell that you are getting the proper care. And there are no rules to it. But Lucy, how did you judge that the people that were assessing you and managing you were good at it? Was it their interpersonal characteristics, empathy? Was it their technical capacity? Was it a combination?
I think, Gordon, it was definitely a combination. I think it's interesting that you mentioned women or female GPs. I had Dr. Dowd, a female GP, and she was wonderfully empathetic, but she was also extremely practical. I sort of told her what I had been going through, and I said all these caveats. I don't know if this is something you can help with. I don't know what kind of a problem this is. If it's a problem, you know, hedging. And she listened to me and she said, no, this is a problem. I can refer you to a number of people. It can be fixed. You know, this is the sort of thing that we're here for. And she then referred me to a psychiatrist, again, a woman who was so lovely and just listened to what I had to say. And the very first thing she said as well was, we can fix this. And within, I don't know how long it was, but it wasn't long. It would have been a matter of a few short months, which in the grand scheme of how long I'd been sick felt like nothing, that I started to feel like myself again. I started to feel like the girl I was when I was 17, not like the young woman I had been for the past 3 years. And that, to me, was amazing.
The words, we can fix it, are they more important if you have something like depression than if you have a broken leg?
I think so, yes, because it's not something that you can look at and say, oh, okay, that's something that has been broken and I don't know how to put it back together. So hearing somebody say, yes, it's a problem, it's a real problem, it's not something that you can fix on your own, but it can be fixed, was a huge, huge relief and really the beginning of the whole process.
Good. We'll have the final question.
Being a teenager myself, I've found that one of the, I guess, issues that isn't so much addressed, especially in presentations to secondary schools, is, I guess, what happens when help doesn't help. Like, most of them are about, helping someone find a way to get some help, get some medical help, see someone, talk to someone, but I have a friend right now who's seen and is seeing numerous professionals, and she's getting better and better at putting on a brave face to them, but internally it's just getting worse. And so for her, it's sort of, everyone's labeling her and saying, this is a problem, we'll fix it, you are depressed, you have this, and we will give you this and you'll be better. But for her, that's, I guess, not what is helping, and that's something that I guess is never really talked about, is what happens afterwards.
My response would be, it's a bit like if you have a cardiac problem. You might start with your GP, and if that's not working, you might move to a specialist cardiologist, and that's not working, you then move to one of the, hot centres, St Vincent's Cardiology or so on and so forth, and so that you go for that high level of expertise would be my recommendation. But other thoughts?
A lot of the problems for teenagers, I think, especially with developing brains, is what about, how with medication and all that sort of stuff, because that's one thing we haven't really touched on. We see a lot in the papers about, people getting prescribed Ritalin right, left and centre and antidepressants. And I was just curious to see what either of you thought about with, do antidepressants, how does it affect a teenage brain or a developing brain? Or
Well, I'll cover my view of it very quickly, and Ian will add to it, because Ian's made a number of public comments about the developing brain and particularly about alcohol. The story in regard to depression is the suggestion that it turns down a particular chemical called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that antidepressants, if relevant, restore or at least improve the BDNF levels. Now, to the extent that that's valid, then that is an argument for treating depression. Now, the second component is that in regard to diet, and we are very excited by the story in regard to omega-3, and we published a big review in 2006 which basically showed correlations between depression rates and fish oil consumption of around about 0.8, which is almost as good as you can get, with bipolar 2 disorder 0.93. And what we know is that fish oil can be an antidepressant in and of itself, studies in children and adolescents, and it can certainly augment antidepressants. So we actually think that there is a big story there. As a clinical signal, it's a weak one. It's only about 5% of people say, hallelujah, I'm cured with fish oil. But fish oil, it has slow effects on the heart, the brain, and so on and so forth. So I think there are a number of ways which you can approach this whole story. But I think I'd want to be quick to say any concerns that somehow antidepressants are toxic or an anathema to the brain for individuals who have the chemical type of depression, I would want to dismiss that concern very quickly. Ian.
I would agree with you for a change, Gordon. I agree with him. The trouble is the lack of studies. I mean, the great majority of studies have been done in people over the age of 25. So there's just a real lack of studies in the area. From my point of view, the only really serious studies, one done by the National Institutes of Mental Health in 400 teenagers. And the bottom line of that is that all treatments work very well. And in fact, drug treatment works just as well as the psychological therapies, and together they work particularly well. There's no evidence, I don't think, of in a sense, harm to the developing brain. There are issues about higher rates of side effects, and I think that is an issue. And I think it's got to do with the higher sort of anxiety and agitation diathesis or presentations you alluded to. So there's a medical monitoring and safety issue which is particularly important. But I think we've seen a good shift in Australia, both with the internet-based therapies and psychological therapies, of getting the order right, which is ideally you'd start with the psychological therapies and other therapies and try and restrict drug use to those who do not respond to those treatments, sort of self-select out as a sort of pragmatic way of doing it. But I think an unfortunate public message has gone out about antidepressants don't work and they do additional harm to teenagers. I think it's a much more of an open story. One of the problems has actually been organising funding and international research to focus actually on the issue. And I think what we'll see now is an increasing focus on trying to work out both novel therapies. I think the fish oil store is very interesting, as are a number of others. Just on that, when help doesn't help, just not to forget that story, help doesn't help, is really important. And in fact, that story gets told much, much more often than help does help. So if you want to discourage people from getting help, you tell them antidepressants don't work and help doesn't help. Right? People go, good, I knew that, I'm not coming. So I think, picking up Gordon's message about that, there are lots of examples where, the first place you go doesn't necessarily solve the problem, either because the problem is more complicated, or in reality, we have a lot of variation in how good the health is in the mental health system. There are some great places, there's some great doctors, there's some great people. I think Gordon's comment's very important, that if you know someone who's not getting help, rather than giving up on help, you've got to go find help that suits them. I think Matthew's picture of, get the right therapist. So once involved in family discussion saying, my psychiatrist doesn't see families, what should I do? I said, get a new psychiatrist, obviously. That, the problem is at times people have very different views. Gordon was alluding to the fact people work to very different models, and some people are complicated. Their illnesses are complicated, and I think often it does take a while to find both a system that's going to help, and what people really need, and probably Matthew and Lucy comment on this, is people to stick with them when they're having that experience, which is really hard for families and others. They finally get to someone to help. They think, oh, thank God, that's it. When only it's just started, actually, really. The truth is, in terms of recovery from all the things we're talking about, it takes a while. Even if you get really good help, it takes a while. And a lot of people's first experiences with help in our healthcare system is not to get great help. And I think this is one of the challenges. While personally, I've been very supportive of the GP kind of bit, and recognise the need to get as much help to everybody quickly. There's the other argument, which I think Gordon has very much sort of, proselytised, which is we need good specialist help too. A proportion of people are more complicated and will require more complex, better assessment and more sophisticated forms of care. So stick with the person.
I think we should finish there because we're now going to hear from Matthew Johnson about resilience. We three will step down from the stage, but I would like you to thank Ian and Lucy and Matthew.
So I'm just going to touch on resilience, and I actually do think that resilience quite often is a little bit like gratitude. It is a bit overused, and it becomes a little bit twee. But I think sometimes, a lot of these things may seem quite obvious to you tonight, but I think there is importance that we need to remind ourselves of the things that we need to do, because we all live very busy lives that is quite chaotic, and sometimes we just stop and we forget how to sort of take stock and breathe and to really check out what's going on. And I just wanted to bring to your attention a website that we've been developing for teenagers. It's for 12 to 18-year-olds. And basically it is a place where they can go and they can share their story. They can upload art, poems, their own story, all that sort of stuff, or they can read other people's. And it's quite a lovely sort of program, and really, the other side of it that we're developing at the Institute is really a bigger part of it, which is also about the positive psychology and the resilience side of it. So there's going to be activities that people can take hold of and do and learn from. So, please check it out. I think it's a wonderful site. So, resilience, understanding resilience. I used to think that resilience was some sort of byproduct of a shampoo or a conditioner, but it's not. Resilience starts with accepting what you can and cannot change, and I think this is a really important concept to come to grips with. We can't change the weather, but we can certainly change how we interact with it. Just as we can't change our history, we can't change the family that we're born into, we can't change our race, but we can certainly change how we think about it, how we feel about it, how we go forward in thinking about it. And this sounds like a bit of a catch-22, but you can't really build resilience without going through some kind of adversity. We as humans, we tend not to like pain, be it mental or physical. We'll go over it, under it, away from it. But when we actually go through something, when we truly try and embrace it and understand it, we can come out the side and be better for it. Be stronger, be wiser, be kinder, have more purpose. And I'm only saying this from my own experience. My life has changed through what I've been through. This slightly scary slide really is about the movies that we play in our minds. They can be IMAX in size, they can be 3D, Dolby surround sound, but they tend to play at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they tend to be horror movies more often than not. And the thing is, our brains are incredibly persuasive. Our brains are incredibly powerful things. And the thing is, whatever our brains, they can tell us all sorts of things that we know not to be true, and this is the truth of it, is that thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are not facts. It's really a simple thing to understand, but it's quite a hard thing to believe sometimes. And the thing is, if you are ever having thoughts that are negative or persuasive or telling you to do something that you know is wrong or could be dangerous to yourself, please talk to someone about it. How do we build resilience? Well, I think it starts with, gravitating yourself towards things that float your boat, that make you happy. Could be art, could be singing, could be music, could be drama, could be sport, all those sorts of things. We all have stuff that we love to do. Be around people that lift your spirits, that make you feel good about yourself. I recently did a talk with an American psychologist, and he said one of the things that he gets asked all the time is, what do you do with toxic people in your life? And he said, well, it's quite simple, just cut them off. Obviously, that's quite difficult if you're married to them, but I think there are, for all the toxic people, there are equal measure of positive people, and we should try and gravitate ourselves towards those people. It's very important. We've done research at the Institute about how exercise, regular exercise, can be as effective for mild to moderate depression as some antidepressants. So I think, exercise is an incredibly important part of my regime. When I'm chalk and cheese, if I don't exercise for a period of time. So exercise is incredibly important to our well-being and resilience. Gordon touched on food. We are what we eat. I've been talking to a nutritionist, and she believes that, a huge percentage of Australians have allergies to wheat. And I think, there's a lot of food allergies. I notice in our kids, if you give them red sweets before bedtime, it's a nightmare. So I think, food certainly has a huge effect on how we feel about ourselves. I know if I eat a lot of sugar, I get a bit edgy, and I tend to do that when I'm stressed or worried about something. So food has a huge effect on how we feel. Yoga's been around for thousands of years, and there's a reason for it. A relaxed body equals a relaxed mind. So, you don't have to take up sort of Ashtanga yoga, but we can do stretches and learn how to breathe properly. It's very important. Knowledge is power. Validation is a great healer. If you are going through something, if you have a mood disorder, learn about it. Read other people's stories. Go on, different websites and see what it is. But also read books that lift your spirits, that make you feel good. It could be about gardening, it could be about photography, whatever it is. Write your own book. This is simply about, you don't have to share your story with anyone, but get your story on paper. Keep a gratitude journal. Keep a mood journal so you can track to see how you're going and how you're travelling. These sort of things can really help. Sing your guts out. We've seen the power of music through The Choir of Hard Knocks. I thought that was just the most amazing documentary. I've got SingStar at home. I do SingStar with my 7 and 5-year-old, and when I do, I always just feel better for it. So I think music has incredibly healing qualities in it. Listen to amazing podcasts and music, and uplifting music. I'm a great baraka for TED Talks. TEDtalks.com, if you've never seen it. I think the line is ideas that change the world, or something like that. They're just phenomenal, and it's full of really inspirational people who are doing amazing things with the world. So stuff like that just can make us feel good about where we're travelling to. Create mantras that you know to be true, that you can believe in. It might not necessarily be these ones here, but something that you know. Because when I say the words, I'm crap, I'm hopeless, I'm a loser, I'm a hack, I'm a joke, you can feel the heaviness and the weight in those words. But if I say, I'm good, I'm kind, I'm worthy, I have purpose, you can feel the energy in those words. And what I say to people is, if you can do it on a post-it note, slap it on the mirror in the morning, brush your teeth to it in the morning, and then brush your teeth to it at night. It's like bookends of the day. And like Mrs. Marsh's chalk and the ink, if we repeat it often enough, it does get in. It does start to affect how we feel about ourselves. Meditation, I'm very passionate about. I've been meditating for about 20 years, and I know, again, like exercise, when I do it, it makes a huge difference in my life. It's like cleaning the windows. I'm more present, I'm calmer, my mood is better, and I'm more focused, I'm more in the moment. And I think, we have 70 thoughts a day on average that are churning and burning in our heads, and I think it just basically turns everything down. It is quite hard for us as humans to sit and be with ourselves for 20 minutes a day, or twice a day, whatever it is, but it is that's why it's called a practice. It's really, really good. Have a cry of a different kind. Go and see some stand-up comedy. Get out some funny movies, all that sort of stuff. Get away from the horror movies and the war movies and all that sort of carry on. I do a lot of talking to farmers, and farmers are terrible at planning ahead for fun things to do. They'll work 7 days a week if they can. And I think, routine is important. Turning up to school, turning up to work, turning up to your job, turning up to uni, all really important, but so is having fun. Setting doable tasks, not redoing your tax or refinancing your mortgage or whatever it is, just simple tasks that you can tick off and work towards. And I think the other thing is that we forget to do is we forget how to reward ourselves. We're so busy and so caught up in doing things that we forget how to actually reward ourselves. But the caveat of this is just don't eat too much cake. And this one is probably the most important slide for me, which is if you have gone through difficulty, if you have learned from that experience, recycle it. Recycle it and help others. Helping others is one of the greatest ways, and it's been proven in research that helping others helps us. It is one of the greatest ways that we can help boost our happiness and feeling within our own community. So, again, I speak from experience for this slide. It sounds obvious, but always try and appreciate the small things. This came from John Kerwin, the rugby All Black great, and he was very preoccupied and very hit by a mood disorder. And he said it really wasn't until he started appreciating, the smell and the taste of a good cup of coffee, the sun on his face, the shower on the back, the joy of a child. Children are a great source of joy. The unconditional love of a pet. I met a psychiatrist in Adelaide who prescribed a dog before he prescribed antidepressants because they're unconditional. You've got to take them for walks, you know, all that sort of stuff. And then just being in nature, you know, and really these pictures really are about sort of trying to practice being more in the moment and being aware of what's going on. Finally, and I think this is so important, if you take the right steps, you do the right thing, and you talk to the right people, I think communication is one of the most important things. And if everyone who's here tonight can leave and go home and have those important conversations with loved ones, we're halfway there. So, and also, always hold on to hope. You know, I think hope is one of the most important words in the human English language. If we can hold on to hope, whatever we're going through, it will pass, it will pass, it will pass. Thank you very much.